Okay, ja, willkommen auch von meiner Seite hier an der Humboldt-Universität und ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, in dem Rahmen hier zu sprechen. Also ich glaube, es ist eine wirklich sehr gute Idee, solche Veranstaltungen zu machen und dann auch natürlich mal so ein bisschen quer zu anderen Dingen zu schauen, wie sich beispielsweise Krisen entwickelt haben und wie Reaktionen auf Krisen stattgefunden haben, wie wir das alles interpretieren. Es ist natürlich ein bisschen schade, dass es keine Übung jetzt dazu gibt. Das hat sich diesmal nicht machen lassen, aus organisatorischen Gründen, aber es wäre natürlich wahrscheinlich ganz nützlich, auch in dem Zusammenhang das noch zu machen. Ich empfehle auf jeden Fall, dass Sie sich, wenn Sie sich für das Thema interessieren, dann auch ein bisschen noch da einlesen. Ich habe gehört, Peter Temmen, da ist was verschickt worden. Peter Temmen ist natürlich ein ganz wichtiger Vertreter, der taucht, glaube ich, auch ein paar Mal auf den Slides auf. Ansonsten habe ich selber vor ein paar Jahren auch so eine Art Überblicksartikel mal zu dem Thema verfasst und das war einfach wirklich gedacht als Überblick über den Stand der Forschung von 2010, ist jetzt also nicht komplett veraltet. Das wäre vielleicht auch noch ganz nützlich, um einfach mal so ein bisschen zu sehen, was gibt es denn auch für unterschiedliche Standpunkte. Ich mache das jetzt auf Englisch. Wenn Sie Fragen haben, dann können Sie die natürlich immer gerne auch auf Deutsch stellen, auch zwischendurch bitte, kein Problem. Und zum Schluss, hoffe ich mal, haben wir auch noch ein bisschen Zeit, um dann noch zu diskutieren. Okay, also, so this is about Europe's Great Depression, and I think it's important to see that this is, you know, there is a distinction between the global Great Depression and Europe's Great Depression. Oder, ich muss mal anders fragen, ist das eigentlich okay, wenn ich das auf Englisch mache, oder ist das ein Problem? Is okay? Yeah? Okay. So mind you, so this focus on Europe, I think, is really, really important to understand what's going on, right? Because there is a difference between what happened in the US and what happened in Europe. And obviously the difference is largely due to the fact that in Europe you have to deal with a lot of sovereign states that have to interact, while in the US the political scale of the problem is different. So this is data that roughly shows you, just in terms of facts, what we're talking about. This is data on industrial production. Of course, this is not really the entire economy, but the point of this is that, well, of course, the Great Depression is largely a phenomenon about problems in industry. And secondly, this data is monthly, which is super important in this context, because we're talking, after all, about a couple of years, right? So the Great Depression more or less started in 1929, and then it ended, roughly in the mid-1930s. That's going to be a part of the problem. When did it actually end? But it's very important to understand what are the interactions between different countries, what are the effects of different policies, right, implemented in response to this crisis, that you see what's going on month by month, right? Annual data doesn't really help you a lot. So I think this is really important to see what happened. And essentially what you see is, okay, well, we start in 1928 is just normalized to be 100. This is the industrial production index, normalized to 1928 being 100, okay? And then you see, well, essentially all these countries are doing okay in 1928, and then something bad apparently happens in 1929, and it goes down, really, really badly down. The worst cases down there are the US, Germany, and Poland, right? And then around, summer, autumn 1932, they have hit bottom, right? And then there's a very slow, sluggish, and only partial recovery. And you see that, for example, Poland, which I think is a super interesting case here, is actually not really recovering very much, right? And while in the US, here that's the black one, and Germany, that's the darker blue one, there is a very strong recovery, right? And of course, part of the problem is that this recovery coincides with the Nazis in Germany taking over power, which was very helpful in stabilizing their political grip.
The scaling on the y-axis, is this in percentage of original productivity, or?
So this is output of industry, right, normalized to being 100 in 1928, okay, and then essentially you see this index. It's an index. It's going. It's it's 100 there, and then it's going down. And this is going down. This is actually nominal index, okay. So it's a yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's 100 for each country. So
yeah, for each country, it's because you see it must be so because they are all kind of clustered together there by construction, okay? So it's just that, let's assume 1928 was a pretty normal year, and then something bad happens, okay? That's an assumption that's sort of entering this data. You could also look at it differently. It wouldn't make such a big difference, really. I mean, you do see something bad is happening in 1929, right? And that's not really an interesting point of discussion, and then it takes really very long before they recover. See? Okay. Now, in order to see the scale of the problem, I think it's always very helpful to actually look at it differently, to say, well, in 1945, after the Second World War, we see in Europe and actually also many other parts of the world economy, massive economic growth. Quite often called the golden age of growth, the economic miracles, okay? So let's ask the question, why don't we see this in 1918? Why wasn't there an economic miracle in 1918? Because in terms of the technologies, it's all there, right? Electrification is there, automobiles, it's all invented, and it's also, you also see mass production already taking place, right? So there is a huge potential for economic development, but this potential is not realized. That is, my proposal to look at it this way, and therefore to of course focus on the issue: why was that not realized, and why did even something so bad happen like the Great Depression? If you look at these technologies that are, of course, in the long run really driving economic development, you see they are special types of technologies. We're talking about electrification, which is something for which you need large infrastructure, a lot of investment. Somebody has to actually collect that money and implement this. This is not a trivial task. And this has very far-reaching implications. The last villages in Europe were reached by electrification somewhere quite often, when I talk about Germany at least, somewhere in the 1920s, right? So they all got access to this new technology that changes everything. It changes industry, changes agriculture, it changes really everything. And cars and also need infrastructure. So essentially, of course, when we are looking at Europe and we see this highly fragmented political landscape with lots of different independent states, that makes clear that cross-border cooperation and coordination of these infrastructures were becoming more important than ever. I think this is an important part of the background. If you look at European GDP per capita, of course, these are also approximations and we don't know exactly, but actually there's also not a big discussion about the trend here, right? If you look at GDP per capita estimations for Europe, 1870 to 2003, you clearly see that there is a deviation from the long-run trend here, right? And in 1913, it doesn't look as if something bad must happen here, but something is deeply going wrong, just in terms of economic policies, and this is the topic for today. And why do you see 3 different bars for each year? Essentially, this is 3 different definitions of Europe. One very broad one where we include in the definition of Europe the Soviet Union and Turkey, right? Which is the Ottoman Empire, and of course all the rest of Europe. And then there is a second definition without Turkey, just the rest of Europe and Soviet Union. and the third one, which is the narrowest one, just none of Turkey and none of the Soviet Union. And it doesn't really matter, right? So you see, these are big trends that are not even shaped by the fact whether or not we include the Soviet Union, which, you know, you could think would be a big deal. It doesn't matter. It's, you know, there's something really big going on and something really big going wrong. Okay, so question, why wasn't there an economic miracle in 1918, but instead a Great Depression? And I'm going to suggest to you, if you want, a neo-Keynesian interpretation, right? Which is pretty close to mainstream in economic history, but not necessarily mainstream in economics. Because if you look carefully, the top economic historians, or the most influential economic historians of the last couple of decades that have been writing about this, are names like Barry Eichengreen and Peter Temin, which are very much in this sort of Keynesian tradition. Anyway, so that's the framework, and I'm going to suggest that what happened was the failure to make the transition from one monetary policy regime to another one. Okay, so in order to make that point, I will introduce you just one framework that I think is very useful, which is called the macroeconomic policy trilemma. Okay, this is an outcome of a standard Keynesian, or actually neo-Keynesian, doesn't matter, macroeconomic framework where you do have some frictions in the economy. We're not caring about where they are coming from. I think it's a super plausible assumption that there are some frictions, so markets do not immediately perfectly react to everything that's going wrong. And out of such a framework essentially pops the macroeconomic policy trilemma, right? And the idea is that this would matter, and that's why we are talking about Europe here. This would matter for small open economies, and it's not the same story for a large economy like the United States. But European states are all small and relatively open, right? And so this is why this framework, I think, really applies. What does it say? You can say, well, policymakers have different objectives, right? They want to reach different goals. And it says that under actually, you know, quite general assumptions, it is impossible to reach all these objectives at the same time. Okay, what can be these objectives? Policymakers in Europe might actually want to have stable exchange rates. Or put differently, they don't really like a lot of exchange rate fluctuations with big trading partners. Why? Because fluctuations in exchange rates are bad for trade, right? They are making trade more risky, and also bad for capital flows, right? Because it's making investment more risky. And that is a problem for both the debtor country, those who actually would like to attract capital into their country because they think maybe that's helping our development, and it's also bad for the creditor countries, those who are thinking about investing elsewhere. So stable exchange rates are something that are, you know, typically liked by policymakers. That's one assumption, okay? Another one is that you might actually want to have pretty free capital flows. We are going to talk about this, right? This is not always the case. But actually we're starting in the 19th century here, and those people in charge of economic policy, that is sitting in, you know, the ministries of finance, central banks, these people were deeply convinced that it's very important to have free capital flows. And they realize over the course of the Great Depression that this can be very, very problematic. But, you know, let's just take it, okay, maybe policymakers want also to have open capital markets. Okay, and if they want to have these two things, then this trilemma just tells you you can't then also have an economic policy that's geared towards domestic objectives, like, oh, something bad is happening to our economy, like, you know, negative demand shock, unemployment is rising, we have to do something about it. Well, actually, if you stick to these two things, right, then you can't do anything about it. So that's the idea that there is a trilemma. You can't actually have all of these things, and there are various ways now to deal with this trilemma. The historical 19th century solution was the gold standard. And the gold standard did the following. You have essentially stable exchange rates fixed between countries, and you have pretty much free capital flows between countries. The flow of gold, but also the flow of other forms of capital was free. But there wasn't really anything like macroeconomic stabilization policy, and it wouldn't have been possible, right? But also policymakers didn't really care about unemployment in the 19th century. That was just not an objective. And you know, by hindsight, we know it also wouldn't have worked. Now, 1945 is a big break point in Western economic development because we have the Bretton Woods regime. And in Bretton Woods, there's some new solution to this trilemma, which is can be called the post-war solution. And the post-war solution is, and that's, you know, I think surprisingly little known, that actually you very, very strongly limited free capital flows, right? So actually 1945 is the year, and then with the emergence of the Bretton Woods system, where capital flows were strictly controlled by all Western economies, be that France, the UK, United States, or West Germany. So capital flows were not free, okay? And you still have pretty much stable exchange rates. You know, that's characteristic of Bretton Woods. But why did they do this? In order to actually get room to maneuver, in order to do something about macroeconomic stabilization. Okay, so that's the Bretton Woods solution. And the modern solution is actually in part this, because if you think about Europe versus the United States or Europe versus Japan, there are clearly no stable exchange rates, and apparently nobody's really worrying too much about that. But you have a lot of focus on domestic policy things like, well, people are worried about unemployment and want to do something about it. And you also have pretty much open capital markets nowadays. So that seems to be on a global scale the modern solution. But interestingly enough, of course, we have also a fourth option, which is that for a bunch of countries, you can actually try to square the circle and form a currency block, which is the euro. And you have super stable exchange rates, and you have super free capital flows. And that's of course the crux, you also have one set of policies, and that can be a problem, as we know. Okay, so this is, I think, a framework to think about, you know, macroeconomic developments in the long runs, at least since the 19th century. So what's the problem now? If you are on option number one, which is the gold standard, you will run into some difficulties. Now, policymakers were used to this option number one, the gold standard, since the 19th century. This was the regime for the first globalization, for the, you know, first really takeoff of all these European economies. And during the First World War, right, of course, immediately in 1914, all the major fighting parties introduced capital controls, so there was no gold standard working during the First World War. But when the war was over, essentially everybody thought, okay, but let's just go back to this regime because it worked pretty nicely. So the idea in 1918 was, well, we essentially want to go back to the regime that we had. But it turned out to be much more difficult. Why? Because the operation of the gold standard depended to some extent on the cooperation between central banks, right? And also on the credible commitment of central bankers to this regime. That essentially meant that the central bankers did nearly everything in order to defend the gold parity of the currency. Think about the pound sterling, right? So the pound sterling under this regime had a gold parity, which essentially means there was a fixed value of pound in terms of grams of gold, right? And because the French franc also had a gold parity, and the Deutsche Mark also had a gold parity, this implied that they all were linked in terms of stable exchange rates to each other. And the idea of these central bankers was that it is the crucial thing for a central banker is to defend the stability of this money and to defend this parity. That was like a holy cow. Okay? And it turned out that this was becoming much more problematic in the 1920s than it used to be before. Why? There are three reasons here. Reason number one is when these countries then somewhere in the 1920s came back to this gold standard after the big shock of the war, not all of them really managed to go back to the pre-war parity. The only country that really did this was, actually the only bank, was the Bank of England. So they returned to 100% 1913 gold parity. That means that really in 1925-6, when they did that, 1 pound sterling was exactly the same as in 1926 as it was in 1913. Other countries initially tried to do that, but they didn't manage to do that because there was so much actually war debt and inflation in the meantime that if they would have done that, they would have essentially, it would have been a massive deflationary shock to the economy, right? So the French, for example, they returned to just 1/5, that is 20% of the 1913 parity. And the Germans did something totally different. So essentially what you had is that, well, they all returned to sort of a gold standard, but at totally different relative values of their currency, which just created a total mess, okay? And there was no coordination whatsoever going on. So that is, some actually think this is the ultimate reason why there was a Great Depression. Okay, second, why wasn't there any coordination? Because it was unclear who would be the leader, right? And they, it was just difficult to talk to each other. So that's another argument made by people like Kindleberger. Another thing that I think is really important is that the idea that the only thing that should be important for a central bank is to keep the currency stable and to defend the parity was getting under pressure. Why? Well, because if you look at the political regimes after the First World War, you see a massive increase in democratization, right? That means that now people are in power that definitely care about other things than just the stability of their investment, right? Namely, left-wing parties, worker parties that care very much about employment. So this is changing the political game, really. I mean, I'll come back to this. So there are a couple of reasons why actually sticking to this old framework was becoming more and more problematic. So the alternatives would have been B and C. If you think about that little picture here, B and C. Okay, so B post-war, right, do away with this, or C modern, do away with this, okay, and combine these two. So why didn't they choose any of that? Well, because these alternatives are considered to be very risky, and I'll come back to that. Access to capital, to keeping capital markets open was seen as, a signal also to international investors that we are doing serious orthodox economic policy at home. So this is a good environment for investment. For example, that explains a lot why Poland was sticking so long to this gold standard regime. They wanted to attract foreign capital. And also, there was a fear that other objectives like unemployment, preventing unemployment would be problematic and would essentially trigger inflation. So essentially, the other alternatives were considered risky, and we'll come back to that. Now, 29 something happens. And while of course the story as always is a bit more complicated in reality, let's just take the following approach. Let's say, well, these European economies are in some sort of steady state, whatever, in some situation where they're doing okay in 1928. And something really bad happens, and this bad happening is coming largely from the outside. That's of course a simplification, but in some part it's true, because there is a Great Depression happening in the United States, and the argument is that this is not a European story, it's a United States story. So let's imagine that something bad is happening to this biggest economy in the world, which is the United States in the 1920s, a really, really bad shock. And what this implies for the Europeans is that the Americans now start to withdraw all their capital. This is a massive withdrawal of capital from Europe to the US. So, of course, the flip side of that is that in the early 1920s, you see a very, very big deal of investment from the United States into Europe, and that is especially into Germany and into Habsburg economies. So Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary. So these countries now are really experiencing a massive outflow of capital. Okay, and that puts them between a rock and a hard place, right? Or Scylla and Charybdis. So you have essentially two difficult, options that are both really not nice, and you have to make a choice between them. So one thing was stick to the gold standard. But sticking to the gold standard in the situation of a massive capital outflow meant that essentially you make things worse, right? Because the reaction would be, well, there is outflow of capital, what to do? Increase interest rates in order to prevent this outflow of capital. That's the only thing you can do. Increasing interest rates is not good for investment, it's not good for aggregate economic activity, and it's probably going to lead to decline of prices, deflation, and even further unemployment, and maybe even a banking crisis. So it's going to be problematic. But the alternatives look ugly as well, right? And policymakers are super worried about all these options. So one option would essentially be something like do what the European Central Bank would have done, namely try to coordinate all these European central bankers and reflate the economy, right, so that you actually get space for monetary expansion. So you could have changed all these gold parities simultaneously, in theory you could have done that, and they were actually talking about this at the time. You could change all these gold parities simultaneously, or all so essentially to keep exchange rates stable, but yet free up room for the central bank to pump extra money into the economy. They didn't do that because they couldn't. They tried. Alternative, you can give up all these stable exchange rates and try to, do it on your own. Or you can, of course, introduce capital controls because, if the problem is that capital is leaving the country, then just stop that. But they were also really worried about that because they thought, once we do that, it will never come back. And that's a problem if you're a capital scarce economy. Okay, so D was tried, result was a combination of C and B. Now, this was just the introduction. Oh dear. Right. So I will essentially just spell out some of the things that I just said and add detail to that. So the big story was that, right? But I will now make the point that this is really what was going on, and there is a lot of interesting detail to that. And I start with the shadow of the First World War. Meaning that the First World War was not really over in 1918, 1990. In a way, it has been an inconclusive test, because it was ended only because of the intervention of the United States, right? So the war in the West was essentially going on forever, and as you maybe know, there was hardly any movement between France, England on one side and Germany on the other on the Western Front before the Americans actually came in and decided that war. Now, once the war was over, the Americans militarily withdrew. So the situation in terms of military capacity was not that clear. Second thing, the European political landscape was becoming more complicated. There were a lot of good things happening because there was a massive democratization. One aspect of that democratization is that various countries now managed to get their own sovereign states, which they were fighting for so long. So that's part of democratization, that Poland became a state again, that Czechoslovakia became an independent state, that Ireland became an independent state. Of course, this is all essentially the spread of democracy, right? They were all, of course, turning into republics. But now you're dealing with even more countries, and that's making international policy coordination, at least initially, more complicated. And the other thing is that you see that political stability was very low, and that is not just true for Weimar Germany, but it's also true, as I'm going to show you in a minute, for France, for example. So the French government was plagued by actually just unbelievable instability. And all these things undermined any efforts to coordinate economic policies across borders, as they do today. So that's a map of Europe 1914. That looks pretty simple. And that's the map of Europe 1923. So you see lots of things have changed. Ireland, the green thing up there, is now becoming independent. Then Germany, of course, has lost some territories in the east. Poland pops up on the map. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, all these states are essentially, yeah, okay, right? So that's, and this gives you the average cabinet duration for the pre-war, the 19th century situation, and the interwar situation. And what you see is that these governments tend to be super unstable across the board, right? So what you have here is in years. In years, the average duration of cabinets. So that means that, for example, in France, the average duration of a cabinet for this period, 1870 to the First World War, was just more than one year and a bit, right? And they didn't have elections every year, but these coalitions were so unstable that they had to reform on average every year, right? And this is not getting better, but actually it's getting much worse. So the average cabinet duration in France in the interwar period is half a year. That means, for example, that between 1920, I think, 1 and 1926, you had 13 ministers of finance. Now make international negotiations with these guys, right? So that's difficult. And this is France, and you all know probably that the Weimar Republic was really plagued by instability. Okay, and France is a winner of the First World War. So that's a problem. The second big problem, of course, is war debt and reparation. So what happened? When the war was over, the Allies, and that is United Kingdom and France and Italy and Belgium, they were running super high debts against the United States. So a big creditor country that was essentially financing this war effort were the United States. And of course also Germany and Austria-Hungary had piled up a lot of debt. On top of this debt then came reparation claims, right? These infamous reparation claims. And part of these claims were, in order to actually repay the war debt to the United States. Okay, so France was sitting on a mountain of debt against the United States. And one reason why they wanted to have the reparation payments from Germany was in order to actually take that and send the money to the US. Okay? And so these things are interrelated. And whenever the Germans demanded, well, we want to have a reduction in our reparation payments, then the French immediately said, yeah, well, first we have to talk about our war debts with the United States. Okay? So that's making things complicated. Couple of other things. It didn't help that 1929, when the London Commission was meeting in order to actually settle the final amount of reparation payments, was the 50th anniversary of Versailles, when in 1871 the Germans had actually managed to get 5 billion gold mark in reparations out of France. So that was a nice coincidence that, you know, so I think these historical memories were important, and a bunch of other things. So actually, you know, this war debt reparation complex is important to see that cross-border coordination of policies were difficult. Even if people understood in principle what are the options, it doesn't mean that they can implement it, right? Because of a lot of frictions here. Okay. This will become clear in summer 1931, which is really kind of the hottest part of this crisis. And there's a lot of activity in order to come up with some international solution to the Great Depression. And this failed largely because of these difficulties. So these were two consequences how the First World War was casting a shadow over the interwar years. Number one, essentially the fact that Europe is becoming more complicated, more states, more democratic states, unstable regimes. Second thing is, you know, this war debt reparation thing. Third thing is clearly hyperinflation. So another consequence of the war was, of course, well, I just said that already, debt, right? What do you do if there is a lot of government debt? So the government had actually issued bonds to the general public with the promise, well, once we have won the war, we will pay back, right? Now, unfortunately, some are losing the war here, and they're still sitting on this debt against their own population. So a simple way out of that is inflation, right? You just inflate your debt away. And this is what's happening in Germany and in Austria and in Habsburg, and it's actually to some extent also happening in France, because the reparation payments are not forthcoming. So there is a lot of inflation immediately after the war, and actually, if you look carefully into the story of the German hyperinflation and the Austrian and Hungarian hyperinflation, these are directly related to the conflict about reparation payments. Anyway, the point is that the experience of policymakers of the worst thing that can ever happen to economies is hyperinflation. This is what they experienced in 1923, 1924. So they have just seen incredible, never ever seen before levels of inflation in Germany to a ridiculous level, so that actually people were going into the pub or the Kneipe, right, and they were buying several beer because it was not clear what was the price of beer the next hour. So it was just madness, total madness. And this is, of course, the experience of policymakers in 1929 when the crisis hits, right? So they think, well, inflation is a very bad thing. We have to avoid inflation. Turns out that this is the wrong advice. Okay, so these are three things why the war in one way or another matters for what's happening now in 1929. Okay, so we are in 1929. Actually, the idea was that the world economy has just about stabilized, right? We're also talking about the golden 20s. A lot of nice things are happening, a lot of culture. You have, in Germany, we say goldene 20er Jahre, les années folles in France. So actually, you know, people associate something rather positive with the 1920s. And also in terms of the economy, if you look at stock markets, for example, these stock markets are really going up and up and up in the 1920s. So that looks like, you know, we are on a good way. And then something bad happens in 1929. And from a European perspective, this bad happening can be interpreted in a shortcut where you have, well, there's capitalists leaving Europe, going back to the United States. So what to do? You see, first, so this crisis spreads from one country to another. It really gets, I mean, so it's hitting across the board in 1929, but then things become worse and worse and worse, not everywhere to the same degree. Austria is really first sliding into something that is not just a business cycle downturn, but it's actually a Great Depression. And that's another, I think, relevant point. Initially, you can look at the Great Depression as, well, this is just a cycle. The economy is always doing cycles, up and down. That's normal, not to worry about. But this is a cycle that goes out of hand. So initially in 1929, people just thought, well, I mean, we've just experienced the last 5 years an upward cycle, and you know, economic theorists were thinking a lot about business cycles in this time. So that was not a surprise, right? So there was an upward cycle, and now we are in a downward cycle. So there's actually nothing to worry about. That was the perspective in 1929. Okay, well, it's not nice, but it's not really serious. And in 1931, people started to realize that something really bad is happening, because this downturn is just going further and further down to an extent that they have not seen before. And the first time that this really becomes obvious is in Europe, is Austria. The biggest bank in Austria, the Kreditanstalt, turned out that they have a little bit faked their books. We all know that. Yeah, so well, and then in 1931, they declare essentially we are close to bankrupt. So this is the largest bank in Austria, far too big to fail. So what happens? The Austrian central bank stepping in, trying to rescue the Kreditanstalt, and this is just too big. So the Austrian central bank is in trouble, because now the gold cover, which is important in order to stabilize the gold standard parity, is under threat. And observers from abroad think, and also actually from within Austria think, they have to leave the gold standard, because they can't keep this parity. So there was capital flight out of the country. And then they had to introduce capital controls, and that was the end of the gold standard in Austria. So that's happening in Austria. It spills over into Hungary. At the same time, you see other sort of trouble in Germany building up. Just to mention one dimension, there are also several big companies in trouble, right? But of course, there's also this political crisis already building up. The Nazis, for the first time, really have a very, very big success as a major election, which is in September 1930, where they really get a substantial share of votes. So this is worrying not just in Germany, but it's also worrying people abroad. And then you see something similar happen in June 1931 compared to the Austrian crisis, namely that several big banks are in trouble. The Deutsche Reichsbank, the central bank, is trying to rescue them. International observers think, well, this is too big, so they actually will have to introduce capital controls in order to make sure that I still keep my money. I better, expatriate that now. So that's a capital flight out of Germany in June 1931. This is, of course, then also linked to a reparations payment crisis, because the German government is short of foreign exchange reparations cannot be paid in German mark. They have to be paid or in German currency. They have to be paid in international currency. That is either in gold or in pound sterling or in French franc or in US dollar. So that's the reparations payment crisis. And then US President Hoover says, well, maybe the best solution is that we freeze all these various debt claims for the moment and make a moratorium on all sort of debt. So the French debt against the United States, the German debt against France, and so on and so forth. That's the Hoover moratorium. And just sit down and talk. What can we do in this situation? So that's the Hoover moratorium. But essentially, that doesn't really help the solution to solve the crisis, also because it's just coming too late because of political opposition. And what happens is that the Germans have to introduce capital controls in July 1931. And essentially, they have left the gold standard. Not because they wanted, but because they have been forced to do so. The next step in the story is Britain. Because I mentioned earlier that what the British did was they returned to 100% parity of before the war. This was down to the idea of the Bank of England that actually we are the gold standard in terms of monetary policy. We are the benchmark, right? And we do it right. And we have promised to everybody in the world before the war that once the war is over, we will come back to the pre-war parity. They did. So we do it. Now what this means is that now Britain, since about 1925-6, has this pre-war gold standard parity. That means this £1 sterling is really worth a lot of gold, right? While the French have just 1/5 of the pre-war parity. And if you look at Germany, they have actually something like 1/1,000,000th of the pre-war parity because there was hyperinflation in between. So these parities are totally out of whack. And that implied that there were no golden 20s in the UK because this economy was all the way in a major crisis. There was no point after the First World War when the UK economy had less than 10% of unemployment. They had always high unemployment. There was anemic, if any, industrial growth. The economy was stagnating. So if you want, for example, American investors looked at the British case as actually the European patient. They are the problem. And they are a very, very weak element of the European economy. So after observing what had happened just in Austria and Germany, where these two countries were kicked out of the gold standard, everybody expected the British to be the next. And this sort of turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy where, well, there was massive capital flight right after July 31st when Germany left the gold standard. Right after that, immediately the crowd, the financial crowd, was picking as the next the British and said, well, they are the next to leave the gold standard. So now let's get our money back out of this country as quick as we can. So there's massive capital flight, and then the British government is trying to stem that, and they are forming a national government. Something incredible happens in British history. For the first time ever, there is a coalition government, right? So maybe you have looked at what's happening in British politics at the time. Coalition is very, very difficult, right? So they don't like coalitions over there. So that's the first time they do that in this national crisis where actually the gold standard is at stake. So they form a coalition national government where the Labour Party, the first time ever, is part of the government, and they achieve a compromise, and they actually agree on some reform programs. But that meant that actually the wages would be cut and unemployment would probably rise, all in order to kind of rescue the value of the currency. And it turns into a strike. It's called the Invergordon Mutiny. And essentially there's a massive strike movement of workers against this policy, and that's the end of it. So September 20th of 1931, then the Bank of England finally decides to give up and change the parity and leave the gold standard. Now some follow Britain out of the gold standard, like the Scandinavians. They just take that opportunity to say, well, if the British have done it, and the British were always fighting for the stability of the gold standard, well, that's a nice excuse to also do it. Well, obviously, why not, right? By the way, the Greeks were also thinking about that, and they decided not to follow them. And that then is, very, very bad decision in Greece at the time, and they are getting deeper into the recession than many others. Anyway, so what you see there is that because of this crisis, many countries are kicked out of this gold standard regime, not because they want it, not because they thought maybe option B or C is better, but option A was just not viable anymore. They couldn't stick to this. But what you see is that because of this, leaving the gold standard, this was a first effective response to the crisis. Do I have that here? Yeah. So what you see here is actually the same data as before, but now it's just organized differently, namely that this is the industrial production index for a bunch of countries again, standardized to 1928 being 100, and then you see, well, the depression is hitting, and then you see that those countries around the sterling bloc, right, that leave the gold standard in 1931 September, don't go further down into crisis, but they actually stabilize, and then they start a very, very sluggish recovery somewhere. While the others, and that is especially called the gold bloc here, that's around France, and it includes Switzerland and Belgium and Holland and Italy and Poland, funnily. These guys actually stick to the gold standard until the bitter end, and they'll give it up only in somewhere 1935-36, right? And that means that they are actually going deeper into depression than others. So essentially that, okay, now I'm not going to go into this. I will make a little shortcut here, but you can now try to understand what makes these countries so different. Why is it that France sticks to the gold standard for much longer? Why is it that Poland does a different policy? Why is Switzerland different from Holland? So you can actually collect data and try to estimate the factors that are making a country stick longer to the gold standard than another country, okay? So I've done that, and something's coming out of that, blah, 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 and I just jump over this, okay? Because, so lots of numbers. You can actually predict with this framework the very month when a country is going to leave the gold standard. Okay, you can do that. But there are two cases that are really difficult to square to the evidence we have from the rest of Europe. And I think this is it's very interesting to understand why. Because apparently there are strictly non-economic factors here that make these two countries so different. And these two countries are France and Poland. And I'm going to say something about that because I think this is very important for understanding what really ended the Great Depression. Yes?
Can you just read what the table says? Because
yes, I can read that.
Can read it.
Okay, so the table says the following. This is, here you have various countries, Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and Sweden, right? So I've done that exercise for these countries. Here you have the actual date of when they left the gold standard. In Austria, this is September 1931, blah, 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 blah. In Poland, it's actually April 1936. So you have a lot of variation. And the question is, why? Why are they so different? Can we make economic sense of that? So then I used a bunch of economic variables, and they do help to predict pretty accurately for many cases when they actually left. I have 6 different models that are slightly different in terms of the method used to predict that and the variables that enter this. And I just don't go into this here, right? But essentially it doesn't matter very much because you can predict, but you can't really predict Poland and France. So the idea here is that something fishy is going on there, something special is going on there, and let's try to understand what is this. There's a question, there's a puzzle, critical phase. Yes?
What about the UK? Very efficient in the model?
Okay. Interestingly, the data for the UK is very incomplete. So I just have the UK as sort of, the UK is part of the model insofar as what happens in the UK is assumed to affect the others, right? So I have the UK as an explanatory variable, but I don't explain the UK because the data for the UK was incomplete. Yeah.
Why are you choosing Poland, for example, that doesn't fit Poland, but for Italy it looks more or less the same in 3 cases or 3 models?
Okay, well, I mean, so the idea is I have one model that works pretty well, okay, but it doesn't work well for France. And so there's no way to kind of twist and tweak these models so that they actually explain France and Poland.
Okay.
And that's why I say, well, let's look into these cases. They seem to be systematically difficult. And now I just want to tell you stories for these countries. And I think, I hope they are roughly plausible. So what you see is that there are hot discussions in France about what to do and whether or not to leave the gold standard. Right? So that's one of the key issues discussed in French politics in the 1934-35, right? And if you look at the French data, you see that actually they enter the Great Depression much later than the others. And also the Banque de France is sitting on a huge pile of gold reserves. Why? Well, actually, if you compare France and Britain, you see that because they had that much lower parity, French industry had a massive comparative, or actually competitive advantage against British industry because their products were so cheap. So there are various reasons why actually it's not so surprising that France became an attractive place also for investment. Anyway, and then they are sliding into this repression in around 33, 34, and more. And then you have discussions. Why wasn't there an exit in May 1936? Actually, there's a French economic historian, Mouret, who has written a lot on that, and he says, well, there are these international discussions, and you see one meeting after the other between the government of the Banque de France and the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the Reichsbank. They actually talk to each other in spite of First World War and all that. They meet regularly and they talk to each other. But the French just say, well, we are not going to change our parity or do anything unilaterally. We want to coordinate that move with you. We want to coordinate, especially with Britain and the US. And this coordination just took ages and they were not coming to an agreement. So then the thing is, what really sort of makes the decision is, I think, the Rhineland Crisis in March 1936. So what was that? After or during the hyperinflation period, 1923, the Rhineland was occupied by French and Belgian troops. Okay, And it was sort of an international zone, and German military was not allowed in the Rhineland. And then the Nazis, as you know, have taken over power in January 1933, and in March 1936, they just re-enter the Rhineland. So they just march back into the Rhineland and reoccupy, so to speak, the Rhineland. Now the major thing is that you probably have never heard about it. Rhineland Crisis? Yes, okay, yeah, but not all of you, come on. Because it didn't spark a major international outcry. And the French were very disappointed, and the Polish were also very disappointed to see that the international reaction to this was actually zero. Okay, so they started to worry, rightly, that maybe the Nazis can do other things, and the British and the Americans are not necessarily coming to our help. So what to do? Well, Rearmament Program. So in March 1936, the French actually start a massive rearmament program, which is essentially a big government spending program. So you need funds for this. Where do these funds come from? Well, one part is monetary expansion. So they do away with gold standard. So that's actually increasing the pressure on the French to change their monetary policy stance. Poland is a very similar case. You can look at Poland, for example, compared to a country that looks a little bit more like it, like Czechoslovakia or Hungary. And if you make this comparison, you see, well, there are two variables that drive that. I'm not going to go into this, but the story for why Poland then leaves in April 1936 is, of course, related. Because the Poles start to be very worried about Nazi Germany. Everybody in Poland is predicting a Second World War. There are books written on that in the 1930s. And so what they do is, for a long time, they actually think the French will come to our rescue and help us. So there is a lot of exchange in military missions between French military officers and the Polish army. There are training programs. And actually, there's the promise from France to invest several billions into Poland, into armament programs. And this money is not forthcoming. And when they then observe the Rhineland crisis and that the French are still talking but actually not really doing much, they decide to do it on their own, leave the gold standard, at the same time start a very big rearmament program. Poland at the time is is bigger than Germany today. Right? So it's in terms of area, it's a big country. 15% of that area were devoted, predominantly to a military complex where they plan to spend 1 billion Polish gold zloty, that is before they actually left the gold standard, to invest in armament. Given the size of this economy, this is incredible amount of money. Okay, so they actually, for the same reason, leave the gold standard, and that's to do with preparation for the Second World War. And that, of course, is now the end of this story. I'm nearly done. Don't worry. We will have some time for discussion. So, one after the other, these countries are kicked out of the gold standard, which in our trilemma story, in principle, opens a way to react to this crisis, because now we can actually pursue expansionary policies, launch employment programs, expansionary monetary policy, make credit cheaper, and so on and so forth, right? Leaving the gold standard all opens these possibilities. The thing is that if you look what they did, hardly anybody does it. So they leave the gold standard, not of choice because they're kicked out of it, but they don't pursue anything like Keynesian monetary expansion or fiscal expansion. Not at all. They do as if they would still be on the gold standard while not being on it, which is weird. That's different for the US, right? So that's why I also always think US is different, okay? So they all continue to do these deflationary policies, and the UK are an example here. So they don't implement anything like programs to restart the economy or to help unemployment, to reduce unemployment. They do this very, very reluctantly then from February onwards, but super reluctantly with not big effects. And the thing is that they are actually, it's sort of funny, but they are still worried about inflation. They've just experienced the largest deflation ever, but in their memory, the thing that seems to be dominating still is actually the hyperinflation of 5 years earlier. So you have a lot of commentators writing in this time saying, well, it's dangerous to do monetary expansion or big government programs because that could bring back inflation. And there's no inflation in sight, right? But they are worried about that. Another thing that's going on is strategic delay. One example is Brüning. So Chancellor Brüning was in charge of German also economic policies during the Great Depression. And part of this program was to convince the international creditor community, that is mainly the French, the US, and the British, that Germany is incapable to pay the reparations. And there were international conferences. No, that's wrong. Well, there were also international conferences, but there was especially one conference that was actually a secret meeting of all the top economists and economic policymakers in Germany. And they were organized back then in the List Society. And in this List Society, they talked about options, what to do in this crisis situation. And the general consensus was, we have to do the following. So Schumpeter was writing about this, for example, later on. We have to do the following. We first have to convince our creditors to get rid of reparations. And once we have been rid of reparations, we have to pursue massive expansionary policies. So the idea that, well, it's no good to kind of tighten the belt in this crisis and actually try to save yourself out of the crisis, the idea that that's not a good idea was totally common among economists at the time in Germany. And they actually had plans to just get rid of reparations, and once they are rid of reparations, then they would actually implement these expansionary policies. So you can, but there's actually a big discussion on that. You can look at Brüning in this way, say they were actually knowing what they were doing, but they wanted to convince the community, the international community, that the German economy is deep in crisis and that they have to actually, get rid of reparations. So that's sort of a game of chicken in a way that's going on. And there are other things that I'm not going to mention. So last thing, there was finally some sort of a recovery. If you look at the data, it looks as if this recovery really starts. So the crisis hits bottom in summer 1932. Then it's not really getting worse then, but there's also no recovery. And the recovery starts in around 35, 36. And if you look into various countries, it looks as if this recovery is largely a preparation for the Second World War, which is not a nice story. So the recovery, the way out of the Great Depression looks as if this is the preparation for the Second World War. And that's definitely also true for the United States. So it makes sense to look at that entire period rather as a second 30 years war than just focus on the events of the Great Depression, because I think you're not going to understand what's going on if you focus too much on these years. So it has to do with the First World War, and it leads into the Second. Final couple of slides, and then I'm really done. Are there any lessons? So this is a pretty complicated story. And of course, I have not said everything that you can say about this, right? It's complex, right? Like the European crisis nowadays also seems to be complex. I want to make the following points. First, the options were largely known. It's not that policymakers were totally blind, but they had a wrong assessment of the risks. They were obsessed by the danger of inflation for too long. That looks as if the last crisis can sometimes be the trigger of the next, right? In the sense that people draw the wrong lessons from the last crisis, and that makes just things worse. That's not a positive lesson. The second thing is you really see that there is this incredible level of political instability, and that there is this interaction between things going wrong at home and problems to solve international problems, right? So that domestic instability limits the ability to coordinate at an international scale. Obviously, because you don't know who is your negotiating partner, and that is clearly important. I mean, for example, I could have said a lot about the issue that in 1932, this was the year of the run-up to the US presidential election, and there was this big discussion between Hoover, the incumbent, and Roosevelt, who wanted to be elected, about economic policy and what to do. And if you think about the link from reparations to war debt and the role of the United States in that, you can easily see that, well, during election, no president will actually say, well, let's waive the European debt so that they are in turn able to forgive the Germans their reparation debt. It was impossible during the election campaign because it was considered to be far too risky if you look at your own electorate at home. So nobody would propose something like that. So that's delaying in this crucial month a recovery, and you can say, well, maybe the Americans are partly to blame for why nothing is moving in Europe, which produces some collateral damage, as we know. There is maybe a role of leadership, so maybe it's helpful sometimes if there's some boss, right, who just says, well, let's do this and not that, because at this time it looks as if there is just no boss and they can't come to any agreement, right? 1945 is totally different because in 1945 there is no discussion who is the boss, which is the Americans are the boss, right? And they just say how this international structure of the Western world is going to look like. And that probably helped. If that is always a desirable outcome, I don't know, but I think in this situation it looks as if this is important. So the lessons drawn in 1945 were these. Quick settlement of war debts, avoid any reparation claims. That's surprising, right? I mean, after all, if there's anything clear, the Germans did start the Second World War. You can have a debate about the first, but not about the second. So why don't the Germans have to pay reparations after the Second World War? Well, because people, and that is especially the Americans, think the reparations were a very bad idea and they have a lot to do with the Great Depression. So that's something that's now coming back like a boomerang to us nowadays. And then also they introduced capital controls. They made a very quick move in this triangle to option B. And that's happening on this international scale. But within Europe, you see something else happening, and that is you see the formation of an ever closer union leading to the euro. And if you look at that triangle, then this is opening a new set of questions, and I think this is always really inspiring. It's coming from Danny Roderick, and maybe you know that. So that there is not just a macroeconomic policy trilemma, which is largely about economic policy choices, but there's a bigger trilemma out there, and that he calls the international or the political trilemma, which is really about the choices between very deep economic integration, which might or might not be desirable, national governance, sovereign national states that actually decide about their rules, and democracy. And he says, well, it's difficult to square these three. And we have various options, like in the macroeconomic policy trilemma, and at the moment we seem to be stuck here. Okay? We have to behave to attract capital, to make traders happy. We want to stick to our sovereign national states, but actually that means that we have to give up some things that maybe the general public would like. Demokratiedefizit, right? So at the European level, that seems to be a problem. And I think that's an interesting interpretation of the European problem. So once you actually have come to a very, very close level of economic integration, but you still want to stick to the sovereign nation states, then you are, you just can't simultaneously make international markets happy and your public. And well, the historical situation was, for most of history, was this, right? Nation states, and then more and more, step by step, more and more democracy, and of course limited integration. Roderick argues there might be a third option, and that might be global federalism, but of course you can also say maybe a European federalism where you say, well, some things have to be dealt with at the European level, not all, but some important things. And that also means then that you would have European democracy. And that's it. Okay, thank you. Questions?
Sie meinten ja vorhin, dass die Illustrationen von Deutschland halt nicht im Goldmarkt gefixt waren, sondern halt in Auslandswährungen.
Ja.
Wenn ich mich richtig zurückerinnere an meine ganzen Geschichten, was auch immer, hatte ich immer im Kopf, dass Deutschland sich die Inflation schön weginflationiert hat. Aber das ist dann nicht ganz richtig so.
Also weginflationiert ist auf jeden Fall nicht richtig. Es war der Versuch einer Weginflationierung eben in der Hyperinflation oder was dann zur Hyperinflation führt 1923. Aber das ging einfach schon deswegen nicht wirklich, weil eben die Reparationszahlungen immer in sozusagen ausländischen Währungen fixiert waren und natürlich nicht in deutscher Reichsmark. Ja, also aber Inflation hat dann trotzdem am Anfang geholfen, weil Inflation natürlich auch immer Umverteilung bedeutet. Man kann Inflation ja als Steuer verstehen, ne, die quasi zwangsweise gezahlt wird. Und wenn der Staat gleichzeitig die Zentralbank auch kontrolliert, dann kann man natürlich Seigniorage Gewinne abschöpfen von Inflation. Also sozusagen das zusätzliche Geld, was gedruckt wird, hat zunächst mal ja auch einen zusätzlichen Wert und den kann man für alles Mögliche verwenden. Das Problem ist nur, dass irgendwann, wenn die Preise zu schnell verfallen, das zusätzliche Geld, was gedruckt wird, sofort, wenn es gedruckt ist, schon nichts mehr wert ist. Sodass das irgendwann vorbei ist, dieses Spielchen. Ne? Aber das stimmt definitiv nicht, dass wirklich Deutschland aus dem Reparationsproblem durch Inflation rausgekommen wäre. Man hat es 23 versucht, aber es hat halt einfach nicht geklappt.
Das ist denn jetzt, wenn ich die lese, was wir jetzt sagen, das ist Wechselkurs. Das ist ja ganz die Idee. Also du fühlst dann, vielleicht steigt einfach nicht, wie fühlst du denn mit der Inflation? Also ich habe jetzt mal Hyperinflation in Deutschland,
ja. Aber
dann macht der feste Wechselkurs so gesehen keinen Sinn mehr. Dann muss ich auch den Wechselkurs ändern, oder?
Stimmt.
Weil sonst könnte ich ja.
Ja, nee, das stimmt. Also was ich vielleicht nicht so ganz klar gemacht habe, also wir haben 1913 diesen Goldstandard, ne? Mit eben diesen Goldparitäten, was dann impliziert, dass eigentlich, also jedes Land fixiert den Wert seiner Währung, Franc oder wie auch immer, in Einheiten von Gold, in Gramm Gold. Ja? Und weil alle Länder das machen, kann man natürlich ausrechnen, was ist denn dann jetzt der Wechselkurs zwischen denen, ist ja klar. Das war 1913. Dann machen die aber erstmal Ende und sagen, okay, jetzt sind wir im Krieg, jetzt gilt das erstmal alles nicht, aber wir versprechen euch, wir kommen, wenn der Krieg zu Ende ist, wieder zurück zu den alten Paritäten. Und die einzigen, die das wirklich machen, sind die Briten. Was machen die anderen? Die können sich lange nicht entscheiden und es gibt mehrere internationale Konferenzen, wo man dann auch darüber redet, aber da kommt immer nichts raus. Und irgendwann 1924, 25 um den Dreh kommt ein Land nach dem anderen auf den Goldstandard zurück, was bedeutet, dass die Regierungen Gesetze verabschieden, in denen drin steht, oder die Parlamente, in denen dann halt drin steht, unsere Währung hat eine Parität von so und so. Also die machen das alle wieder mit dem alten Goldstandard, nur dass diese Paritäten alle anders aussehen. Und diese Art von quasi Gesetzgebungen, die finden alle so um 1924, 25, 26 statt. Das heißt, in der Zeit der Hyperinflation ist in dem Sinne Deutschland nicht auf dem Goldstandard. Ja, das ist also alles noch im Fluss. Und wenn man dann guckt, na, was macht denn der Wechselkurs, zum Beispiel der deutsche Wechselkurs gegenüber den US-Dollar, ist, dass er halt dann einfach, am Anfang ist irgendwie, musst du 1000 Mark für einen Dollar zahlen, dann ist 1 Million, dann ist 1 Milliarde und dann irgendwann kannst du die Nullen nicht mehr zählen.
Kann ich versuchen, sozusagen als Regierung, wenn ich sozusagen schneller Geld drucke, als ich die internationalen Finanzmärkte anpassen könnte von der DEA, also meine eigenen Wechselkurse zu überholen, oder laufen Wechselkurse dem voraus? Also ich weiß nicht, wie rigide der Markt ist oder wie schnell der da reagieren kann. Ja, ich habe dann auch genau jetzt erinnert, aus der Schulzeit, ich so komplett im Kopf so, ja, die Idee war halt, man wollte sich die Inflation wirklich wegregulieren. Ja, Deutschland druckt Geld, um halt die Inflationszahl auszugleichen.
Genau, also wie gesagt, das passiert 1923 zu einem gewissen Teil, was dann die Konsequenz ist, dass die Franzosen, die Belgier ins Rheinland einmarschieren, weil sie sagen, wir müssen das anders machen, die Deutschen zahlen nicht mehr ordentlich, die Wirtschaft ist ohnehin zusammengebrochen wegen Hyperinflation, wir gehen einfach rein und holen uns die Sachen. Also wir holen die Kohle selber raus. Ne? Das führt dann in Deutschland zum Bergarbeiterstreik, Generalstreik sogar, also schlimmer als Bahnstreik. Und dann sagt die Regierung, ja, wir unterstützen euch, streikende Bergarbeiter, und drucken Geld, um eure Löhne zu zahlen. Und das macht die Sache natürlich noch schlimmer und dann irgendwann ist eine Pattsituation und das Ergebnis ist der Dawes-Plan. Es gibt also 1923 eine neue internationale Konferenz, wo man sagt, okay, wir machen das jetzt, und das waren dann die Amerikaner, die das koordiniert haben. Da kommt also Leadership wieder rein und die Amerikaner sagen, okay, ihr könnt euch hier nicht einigen. Dawes ist ein amerikanischer Banker gewesen, Charles Dawes. Und die sagen, wir müssen zwei Sachen gleichzeitig klären. Wir müssen erstens klären, wie das mit dem Goldstandard auszusehen hat. Den müssen wir wieder einführen, also irgendwie Stabilitätsanker irgendwo werfen. Was sind denn diese Währungen eigentlich wert? Und zweitens müssen wir einen neuen Plan haben, wie viel die Deutschen jedes Jahr zu zahlen haben. Und das ist der Dawes-Plan, diese Kombination. Genau, und das geht dann ein paar Jahre gut, dann reden wir über die goldenen 20er Jahre und das sieht alles fein aus und dann irgendwie merkt man aber, dass dieses System irgendwie sehr, sehr zerbrechlich war und mit der großen Depression dann zerbricht. Da war erst hier ein...
Ja, ich versuche die ganze Zeit das so ein bisschen auf die aktuelle Situation natürlich zu übertragen und es würde mich interessieren, was Sie dazu meinen. Es gibt ja mehrere Wirtschaftswissenschaftler, die behaupten, wenn man, das war ja auch die Entscheidung von Italien eigentlich, die behaupten, dass mit einer Inflation sozusagen Griechenland auch seine Schulden weginflationieren könnte. Und dass das ein Grund gewesen sei, aus dem Draghi da diese ganzen, was denke ich, das war irgendwie eine unglaublich hohe Zahl. Also wir werden das dann erzählen, aber es war an 2011 wurde da auch nicht was reingegeben an Geld und dann jetzt noch mal von Monaten. Und meinen Sie, dass das eine berechtigte Theorie ist? Oder wie sehen Sie das?
Also natürlich sagt kein Mensch offen, dass man die Schulden weginflationieren möchte. Ne? Aber es ist halt ein Problem, wenn man Schulden hat und gleichzeitig die Preise mehr oder weniger stabil sind oder sogar das Risiko, dass sie fallen, weil dann die Schulden tendenziell immer größer werden. Also man braucht ein gewisses Level an Inflation, damit die Sachen zumindest nicht noch schlimmer werden. Historisch übrigens ist es so, dass also wenn Länder auf großen Schuldenbergen saßen, sind sie in der Regel über Inflation da wieder rausgekommen. Nicht Hyperinflation, aber hohe Levels von Inflation. Das ist der sozusagen Historical Record in der Regel richtig hohe Schuldenberge, meistens dann eine Kombination aus, der Wirtschaft geht es wieder gut und sie wächst, und Inflation. Ja? Was man halt jetzt versucht, glaube ich, durch diese lose Geldpolitik ist erstmal den Staaten also ein bisschen, also es gibt ja auch Aufkäufe von diesen Staatsanleihen, ne? Dass man den einzelnen Regierungen dadurch mehr Freiräume verschafft, indem sie eben diese Staatsanleihen leichter platzieren können, weil die Privatinvestoren, die kaufen, wissen, dass die Zentralbank die dann ja nachher ihnen wieder abnimmt, was halt, naja, nur so ein Zyklus ist. Ja? Aber das ist eigentlich so eine Art Notinstrument, weil es ja keinen anderen Krisenmechanismus gibt, außer dass eben jede einzelne Regierung versucht, selber durch individuell gestrickte Reformprogramme die Wirtschaft wieder flott zu machen. Und das scheint ja nicht so richtig zu funktionieren. Also so eine offene Idee, man will irgendwie über Inflation aus der Schuldenkrise rauskommen, ist, glaube ich, nicht da. Ist eher so die Idee, wir müssen auf jeden Fall Deflation verhindern und wir wollen vor allem, naja, also wir wollen halt irgendwie der Wirtschaft helfen, wieder zu wachsen, weil das dann natürlich auch hilft, die Schulden zu reduzieren. Ja.
Ja, mit dem Vergleich des Zweiten Dreißigjährigen Krieges finde ich ganz interessant. Allerdings frage ich mich, inwieweit der Zweite Weltkrieg überhaupt entstanden wäre, wenn es keine große Inflation gegeben hätte. Also wie bei Deutschland zum Beispiel Nazis überhaupt an die Macht gekommen wären, wenn es die Wirtschaft gegeben hätte. Ja. Einerseits eine Frage, wie sehen Sie das? Also glauben Sie, der wäre vielleicht gar nicht entstanden ohne die Deflation? Weil man sieht jetzt auch gerade nach der Euro-Krise, die jetzt in Europa die Richtung oder extrem erfahren. Und das andere generell Parallelen sehen Sie jetzt zur Finanzkrise oder auch vielleicht Fehler, die sich wiederholen.
Okay, also zum Ersten, das kann man relativ eindeutig beantworten, da gibt es auch wirklich eine ganz gute Forschung dazu. Man kann nämlich zeigen, dass also ich meine, wir haben ja in Deutschland viele Wahlen in dieser Zeit und dann natürlich auch entsprechend viele Daten über Wahlergebnisse auf so einer ziemlich lokalen Ebene. Und gleichzeitig haben wir auch sehr gute Daten zum Beispiel zur wirtschaftlichen Entwicklung und Arbeitslosigkeit auf dieser Ebene. Und man kann also mit ziemlich robusten Verfahren kann man nachweisen, dass die großen Wahlerfolge der Nationalsozialisten sehr viel mit Arbeitslosigkeit zu tun haben. Ja? Das heißt natürlich jetzt nicht, dass das alles nur irgendwie ein ökonomisches Phänomen gewesen wäre. Ja? Das möchte ich jetzt nicht behaupten, aber also die Nationalsozialisten waren nun mal halt am Anfang der 20er Jahre eine von vielen rechtsradikalen Splitterparteien und völlig unbekannt. Und dann haben sie zwei Sachen quasi richtig gemacht. Das eine war, sie haben sich an die Spitze der Bewegung gesetzt, die sagt, wir wollen die Reparationen abschaffen, und zwar ganz, ganz offen. Das war die Kampagne gegen den sogenannten Young-Plan, das war der Nachfolger vom Dawes-Plan. Also da haben die Nationalsozialisten es erstmals geschafft, sich an die Spitze der ganzen Rechtsradikalen zu setzen. Und wurden damit auch schlagartig irgendwie bekannt und ihr Führer war der große Führer auf einmal, nicht nur einer von vielen. Und dann halt haben sie eben vor allem sie haben sich ja Nationalsozialisten genannt, ne? Und die haben halt auch am Anfang ganz klar eine Politik gemacht und vertreten, eine Wirtschaftspolitik, die vor allem Bekämpfung der Arbeitslosigkeit war. Ja, also daher eben auch dann diese Anlehnung an sozusagen linke Rhetorik mit Sozialismus und so weiter und so weiter. Das haben sie dann 1933 ganz schnell über Bord geworfen, weil dann war relativ klar, es interessiert uns überhaupt nicht, was im Arbeitsmarkt losgeht, wir wollen aufrüsten. Und das erledigt nebenbei auch noch die Arbeitsmarktprobleme. Okay. Das war das eine. Das andere jetzt zur Finanzkrise, das ist natürlich, also ich glaube, das ist wirklich ganz spannend. Da kann man ein bisschen drüber nachdenken, über dieses Rodericksche Trilemma im europäischen Kontext. Es bedeutet halt einfach, dass man die europäischen Probleme, glaube ich, durch eine dezentrale Koordination von nationalen Politiken, glaube ich, nicht in den Griff bekommen wird. Und das Witzige ist, wenn man mal schaut, was ist denn zum Beispiel 2005, 6, 7 von Finanzwissenschaftlern diskutiert worden, auch ziemlich konservativen Finanzwissenschaften, die beispielsweise heute in der AfD sind. Ja? Also von Finanzwissenschaftlern, die haben ganz heftig darüber diskutiert, vor dieser 2008 folgenden Krise, wie man denn einfach aus Europa Sinn machen könnte, im Sinne von Subsidiaritätsprinzip. Das heißt, einige Sachen müssen halt auf der lokalen Ebene gemacht werden, andere auf der nationalen und eine dritte Art von Aufgaben müssen halt auf der übernationalen, europäischen Ebene geregelt werden. Und das bedeutet halt vor allem, das ist das Entscheidende, das bedeutet halt vor allem, dass man auch die Steuerhoheit zum Teil auf diese Ebenen verlagern müsste. Was natürlich auch wiederum bedeutet, dass es demokratisch legitimiert sein müsste und es müsste ein Parlament geben, das dann über diese Steuereinnahmen und deren Verwendung entscheidet und so weiter und so weiter. Und das ist diskutiert worden, ganz intensiv in einer großen Literatur und von denen will jetzt gerade keiner mehr was davon wissen. Und ich glaube aber, dass das auch in dem Kontext Sinn macht. Natürlich, man kann jetzt, es macht gar keinen Sinn zu sagen, wir brauchen irgendwie den europäischen Superstaat, der jetzt alle Probleme löst, aber es ist auch witzig zu gucken, was ist denn in den USA passiert. Denn in den USA gibt es ja auch einen sehr, sehr langen Weg in Richtung der Etablierung einer zentralen Federal Government. Da könnte ich jetzt auch noch was zu erzählen, weil das natürlich auch was mit den Reparationen zu tun hat, denn es war das Federal Government, was die Kredite rausgegeben hat. Die waren aber noch sehr klein und die hatten sehr wenig Steuerhoheit. Das heißt, die Federal Government, die hätten gar nicht die Reparationen oder die Kriegsschulden, die Kriegsschulden den Franzosen vergeben können, weil das nämlich so ein großer Teil am Haushalt war, dass man sozusagen seine Handlungsfähigkeit damit in Frage gestellt hatte. Das heißt, die Tatsache, dass die USA damals noch ein sehr, sehr kleines Federal Government hatten, hat die Kriegsschuldenproblematik schlimmer gemacht und die Lösung der europäischen Krise verzögert. Ja, okay, also wie gesagt, meine Anregung einfach nur das vielleicht mit nach Hause nehmen, mal drüber nachdenken, ob man da so seinen Sinn draus machen könnte und ja, vielleicht können Sie dann in ein paar Jahren selber dann interessante Forschungsbeiträge dazu abliefern. Danke.